The Cold War is remembered as a time of tense diplomacy, proxy battles, and ideological standoffs that never quite escalated into the global war everyone feared. That version is correct only if you ignore the moments when deliberate restraint had nothing to do with survival. What kept the superpowers from annihilating each other was not always wisdom or negotiation. It was luck, malfunction, individual defiance of protocol, and systems that failed in ways that happened to prevent rather than trigger extinction. The archives that have opened since the 1990s reveal a conflict defined less by speeches and summits than by accidents that were classified, near launches that were buried, and decisions made by machines or exhausted personnel in windowless rooms where the concept of accountability had been engineered out of existence. This was not a Cold War. It was a rehearsal for apocalypse that ran continuously for decades, and the fact that the curtain never rose on the final act was not a triumph of human judgment. It was a statistical anomaly. In 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs broke apart over North Carolina. Each bomb had a yield of 4 megatons. The plane experienced mechanical failure at high altitude and began to disintegrate. As it fell, the crew ejected, and the bombs were released from the braking fuselage. Both weapons began their automatic arming sequence during descent. One bomb deployed its parachute and landed in a tree. The other plunged into a muddy field and embedded itself deep in waterlogged soil. Recovery teams arrived and extracted the first bomb without incident. The second bomb was partially retrieved, but one portion remains buried because the shaft flooded repeatedly and the retrieval was abandoned. Investigators later confirmed that on the bomb recovered intact, 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms had failed. A single low-voltage switch remained in the safe position. That switch, according to declassified reports, was described as vulnerable to malfunction under the conditions experienced during the fall. Had it closed, the weapon would have detonated over North Carolina with a blast radius encompassing nearby communities and fallout spreading across the eastern seaboard. The incident was kept from public knowledge for decades. The official narrative emphasized that safety systems functioned as designed. The classified assessment stated that the margin between disaster and recovery was a single switch that operated correctly more by chance than by redundancy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, the world's attention was on surface deployments and naval blockades. What remained hidden was the presence of Soviet submarines in the Caribbean, each carrying nuclear torpedoes. On October 27th, the USS Beale began dropping depth charges on the Soviet submarine B-59. The charges were practice signaling devices, but the submarine crew, which had been submerged for days in extreme heat with failing life support and no communication with Moscow, interpreted the explosions as the beginning of war. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Soviet protocol required agreement from 3 officers to authorize use of nuclear weapons. The captain and the political officer both agreed. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. There was no procedural mechanism for his refusal. His rank as flotilla commander gave him presence but not veto power. He argued against the launch. The debate occurred in a submerged steel chamber with depleted air, overheated equipment, and no guidance from command. Archipov's resistance delayed the decision long enough for the captain to reconsider. The submarine surfaced and withdrew. The existence of nuclear torpedoes on Soviet submarines was not confirmed by the United States until decades later. Archipov's role was not publicly documented until after his death. His decision was not an act of policy. It was personal refusal in a system designed to eliminate personal discretion. In 1979, NORAD's early warning system detected a large-scale Soviet missile launch. Alarms sounded. Duty officers followed protocol. The alert reached the command structure. Bomber crews were placed on alert. Missile silos prepared for launch authorization. The detection was based on data processed by the system's central computer. Within minutes, additional checks revealed inconsistencies. A technician identified the source. A training simulation tape had been inadvertently loaded into the live system. The simulation depicted a full Soviet first strike. The system could not distinguish between the simulation and actual radar data. For several minutes, the United States operated under the assumption that it was under attack. The error was caught because procedures included brief verification windows before irreversible action. Those windows were measured in minutes. The system was corrected. Protocols were updated. 6 months later, a similar incident occurred. A malfunctioning chip in a communication system generated a false launch indication. Once again, alert levels escalated. Once again, cross-checking revealed no corroborating evidence. Once again, the error was identified before launch authority was requested. Both incidents remained classified for years. The public explanation emphasized the robustness of safeguards. The internal assessment noted that the system had twice moved toward launch based on data that was entirely false, and that human verification had only minutes to override automated threat interpretation. Project Sunshine was a classified research program conducted by the United States Atomic Energy Commission during the 1950s. Its purpose was to measure strontium-90 levels in human tissue, particularly in bones, to assess the global distribution of radioactive fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing. Strontium-90 mimics calcium and accumulates in bone, especially in children. The research required samples of human tissue. The program involved the covert collection of body parts from deceased individuals, including infants and children, without the knowledge or consent of their families. Hospitals, morgues, and institutions in the United States and several other countries participated, often unaware of the program's full scope. Tissue samples were shipped to laboratories for radiological analysis. The project's existence was not disclosed to the public. Families were not informed that remains had been harvested. The data collected was used to model fallout dispersal and internal contamination rates. When portions of the program were eventually revealed, official responses emphasized the scientific necessity and the context of Cold War survival research. The ethical framework that permitted the program was not anomalous. It was an expression of a broader institutional logic in which consent and transparency were subordinated to national security objectives that were themselves classified. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union deployed an automated system designated Perimeter, known informally as Dead Hand. Its purpose was to ensure retaliation in the event that Soviet leadership was destroyed in a first strike. The system was designed to detect nuclear detonations on Soviet soil, monitor communication lines with leadership, and assess whether command authority still existed. If it determined that leadership had been eliminated and that the country was under attack, the system could autonomously order the launch of remaining ICBMs. Perimeter relied on seismic, radiation, and communication sensors. It included a command module that could send launch orders directly to missile silos without human initiation. The system was built to function when no one was left to give orders. It bypassed the need for surviving commanders, cabinet members, or party officials. The decision to retaliate would be made by a machine following parameters set in advance. Perimeter was not hypothetical. It was operational. Soviet officers have stated that it was activated during periods of heightened alert. The system's existence was not confirmed publicly until after the Cold War ended. Its operational status during various crises remains partially classified. The system embodied a doctrinal assumption that human survival was less important than ensuring that aggression would not go unanswered. Retaliation was not dependent on intention or judgment. It was a mechanical certainty. In 1983, NATO conducted a command post exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise simulated the transition from conventional war to nuclear release. It involved encrypted communication, radio silences that mimicked wartime conditions, and the participation of high-ranking officials, including heads of government in some phases. The realism was unprecedented. Soviet intelligence monitored the exercise and concluded that it might be cover for an actual first strike. The KGB and GRU issued alerts. Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe were placed on heightened readiness. Some units moved to forward positions. The Soviets began preparations that mirrored their own protocols for imminent conflict. The exercise continued without NATO's awareness of the Soviet reaction. The danger was not that NATO intended to attack, but that Soviet doctrine interpreted the simulation as indistinguishable from preparation for war. The crisis de-escalated when the exercise concluded on schedule, and no further hostile indicators emerged. Soviet leadership did not communicate their alarm to the West during the exercise. The United States did not learn of the Soviet response until intelligence assessments were completed months later. A presidential review followed. The conclusion was that the Soviet Union had genuinely believed it was on the verge of being attacked. The proximity to miscalculation prompted changes in how exercises were conducted, but those changes were incremental. The doctrinal assumption that the other side might launch without warning remained intact on both sides. Able Archer demonstrated that war could begin not from aggression but from mutual interpretation of defensive postures as offensive intent. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers maintained continuous airborne alert missions in which bombers armed with nuclear weapons flew near or along the borders of hostile territory. The United States operated Chrome Dome missions, in which B-52 bombers carrying thermonuclear weapons circled for hours at the edge of Soviet airspace. The intent was to ensure that a portion of the strategic bomber fleet would survive a surprise attack and be able to retaliate. The missions were flown around the clock. Crews were in the air for shifts exceeding 12 hours. The planes refueled mid-air. Mechanical failures, human fatigue, and navigation errors were inevitable over thousands of sorties. In 1966, a B-52 collided with a refueling tanker over Palomares, Spain. 4 hydrogen bombs fell from the broken aircraft. 2 detonated their conventional explosives on impact, scattering plutonium across farmland. 1 landed intact. 1 fell into the Mediterranean and required months of searching before it was recovered from the seafloor. The contamination required removal of tons of topsoil and years of monitoring. In 1968, another B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The impact ruptured all 4 nuclear bombs aboard. Plutonium was spread across the ice. The cleanup involved removing contaminated ice and debris, some of which was never fully recovered. 1 bomb's secondary stage was not found. These were not isolated incidents. They were predictable outcomes of a system that required weapons to be in constant motion under conditions where error rates could not be reduced to 0. Each crash was followed by investigation, policy review, and modification of procedures. The missions continued because the strategic calculus prioritized readiness over the cumulative risk of accidents. The term used internally was acceptable risk. The public was told that all safety measures were adequate. In 1969, the Soviet Union and China were engaged in armed border clashes along the Ussuri River. The conflict escalated to the use of artillery, tanks, and organized infantry assaults. Both nations were nuclear armed. Soviet leadership discussed options for a preemptive strike against Chinese nuclear facilities. The discussions were serious enough that the Soviet government probed the United States for its likely response. The inquiry was indirect, delivered through diplomatic and intelligence channels. The United States provided no clear answer, which the Soviets interpreted as a lack of support for such an operation, but also as a lack of opposition. The strike was not carried out. The reasons included logistical challenges, uncertainty about Chinese retaliation, and concern that the attack would not fully eliminate China's nascent nuclear capability. The decision was strategic, not moral. The option remained on the table in internal planning documents. What prevented the first use of nuclear weapons between communist powers was not shared ideology or alliance, but an assessment that the operation's success could not be guaranteed and that failure would be catastrophic. The border conflict continued intermittently for months. It was eventually frozen through negotiation, but the willingness to consider a nuclear strike as a tool of border management indicated how normalized such options had become within the decision-making apparatus of a superpower. The United States and Soviet Union both developed chemical and biological weapons throughout the Cold War, despite public commitments to international norms. The U.S. maintained stockpiles of nerve agents, incapacitating chemicals, and biological agents, including anthrax, tularemia, and botulinum toxin. Research facilities conducted open-air tests. In some cases, simulants believed to be harmless were released over populated areas to study dispersal patterns. Declassified documents describe tests in which bacteria were sprayed over San Francisco, New York subway systems, and other locations to evaluate how a biological attack might spread. The tests used organisms considered non-pathogenic at the time, though later reviews indicated that some caused infections in vulnerable populations. The Soviet program was larger. It operated under the cover of pharmaceutical and agricultural research. Facilities produced weapons-grade anthrax, plague, and smallpox. The program continued after the Biological Weapons Convention was signed in 1972. Defectors later revealed that the Soviet Union maintained an industrial-scale production capability and had weaponized agents designed to evade vaccines. An accidental release from a facility in Sverdlovsk in 1979 killed dozens. The official explanation was contaminated meat. The actual cause, confirmed years later, was an aerosol release of anthrax spores from a military research facility. Both nations justified their programs as defensive or as necessary leverage. Neither dismantled their capability until the Cold War's end, and even then, dismantlement was incomplete. The infrastructure, knowledge, and doctrinal willingness to use biological agents in warfare remained embedded in institutional memory. Espionage during the Cold War was not limited to intelligence gathering. It included active measures designed to destabilize, deceive, and manipulate the adversary's decision-making. The Soviet KGB conducted Operation Infection, a multi-year disinformation campaign that spread the claim that the United States created the AIDS virus in a military laboratory. Fabricated documents were placed in media outlets in developing countries. The story was amplified by sympathetic journalists and fringe publications until it gained traction in mainstream discourse. The operation's goal was not to be believed universally, but to introduce doubt, erode trust in American institutions, and complicate U.S. relations with African and Asian nations. The campaign was successful in that the narrative persisted for years and required sustained counter-messaging. The United States conducted similar operations. The CIA funded media, political parties, labor unions, and cultural organizations in Europe, Latin America, and Asia to counteract Soviet influence. In some cases, this involved straightforward support for anti-communist groups. In others, it involved creating fake organizations, planting false stories, and discrediting rival movements through forgery and character assassination. Both sides engaged in active measures that blurred the line between information and psychological warfare. The operations were not about truth. They were about controlling perception in ways that would shape policy, public opinion, and the behavior of neutral governments. The Cold War was fought as much in newsrooms and universities as in missile silos. In 1980, a Titan II missile exploded in its silo in Damascus, Arkansas. The missile carried a 9-megaton warhead. A maintenance crew was performing routine work when a tool was dropped. The tool punctured the missile's fuel tank. Liquid propellant began leaking. The vapor was toxic and volatile. The crew evacuated. Specialists were called in. Hours passed as pressure built inside the silo. The decision was made to continue monitoring rather than attempt immediate neutralization due to the risk of ignition. The missile exploded. The warhead was ejected from the silo and landed in a ditch several hundred feet away. It did not detonate. One member of the maintenance crew was killed by the explosion. Several others were injured. The site was contaminated with propellant residue. Investigation revealed that the accident was caused by procedural violation and inadequate tooling protocols. The Titan II was a first-generation ICBM that used hypergolic fuel, which ignites on contact between oxidizer and fuel. The design was known to be dangerous. Accidents involving Titan missiles had occurred before. In 1965, a fire in a Titan II silo in Arkansas killed 53 workers. The missiles remained operational because they were part of the strategic triad, and deactivating them would reduce launch capacity. Safety was subordinated to readiness. The Damascus incident prompted the retirement of the Titan II, but only after decades of service, during which the risk was considered acceptable. Submarines armed with ballistic missiles operated under orders that prioritized stealth and survivability above all else. Communication with submerged submarines was limited. Extremely low-frequency radio could penetrate water, but the bandwidth was minimal and the messages were pre-coded. A submarine on patrol could spend months submerged with little information about the status of the world above. Launch orders could be transmitted, but verification was not always possible. Submarine commanders operated under sealed orders that authorized retaliation if certain conditions were met, including loss of communication with command authority. The assumption was that if the submarine could not reach leadership, leadership no longer existed. In such a scenario, the commander had discretion to launch. This placed the decision to begin or continue a nuclear war in the hands of individuals who might have no current information, who could be acting on outdated intelligence, and who were operating under psychological and physical stress after months of isolation. The system relied on the professionalism and restraint of submarine commanders. It also assumed that their judgment would align with national interest even in conditions of total uncertainty. Several instances have been described in which submarine commanders received ambiguous signals, debated whether they constituted valid launch authority, and chose to wait for clarification. These decisions were not required by protocol. They were individual choices that prevented escalation. The system did not prevent those choices, but it also did not mandate them. The Tsar bomber was detonated by the Soviet Union on October 30th, 1961. It remains the largest nuclear weapon ever tested. The yield was 50 megatons, though the design allowed for a yield of 100 megatons if fully fueled. The bomb was dropped from a modified bomber over the Novaya Zemlya archipelago in the Arctic. The explosion created a fireball 5 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rose to a height of 42 miles. The shockwave circled the Earth 3 times. The flash was visible 600 miles away. Windows shattered at distances exceeding 500 miles. The purpose of the test was not military. The weapon was too large to be practical for delivery in war. It was a demonstration. The Soviet Union wanted to show that it possessed the technical capacity to build a bomb of unlimited yield, and that it was willing to test such a device. The test was announced in advance to ensure that the world was watching. The message was that there was no upper limit to destructive capability. The United States did not attempt to match the yield. Instead, it focused on miniaturization, accuracy, and multiple warhead systems. The strategic conclusion was that 50 megatons on a single target was inefficient. Smaller weapons distributed across many targets were more effective. The arms race shifted from yield to quantity and precision. Tsar Bomba became a symbol, but the practical trajectory of weapons development moved toward systems that could destroy more with less warning and less chance of interception. Psychotropic and chemical agents were researched extensively by both superpowers for use in interrogation, incapacitation, and assassination. The CIA's M-Culture program tested LSD, barbiturates, amphetamines, and other substances on unwitting subjects, including prisoners, patients, and agency personnel. The goal was to develop techniques for mind control, memory erasure, and resistance to interrogation. Experiments were conducted at universities, hospitals, and prisons, often without informed consent, and sometimes without the knowledge of the institutions involved. Subjects experienced severe psychological trauma. Some died. Others suffered long-term mental illness. The program was discontinued in the early 1970s, and most records were destroyed. What survived was incomplete and heavily redacted. Congressional hearings in the mid-70s revealed portions of the program, but the full scope remains unknown. The Soviet Union operated similar programs under different names. Defectors described research into drugs that could simulate mental illness, induce confessions, or incapacitate without leaving physical evidence. Some substances were reportedly used in interrogations and in operations against defectors or dissidents abroad. The programs reflected a broader logic in which the human body and mind were treated as systems to be manipulated in service of intelligence objectives. Consent, legality, and medical ethics were obstacles to be circumvented through classification and compartmentalization. Nuclear war planning required the identification of targets. The United States maintained a list called the National Strategic Target List, later integrated into the Single Integrated Operational Plan. The list included military installations, command centers, industrial facilities, and population centers. Targeting doctrine evolved over time. Early plans emphasized counter-value targeting, which meant cities. The goal was to maximize destruction of the enemy's society and economy. This shifted toward counter-force targeting, which prioritized military assets and nuclear capabilities. In practice, both approaches overlapped. A strike on a missile silo might be counterforce, but the silo was often near a town. A strike on a command bunker might collapse a city above it. The plans assumed large-scale casualties. Estimates for a full exchange ranged from tens of millions to hundreds of millions dead in the first days. Fallout, starvation, and collapse of medical and civil infrastructure would follow. Some models suggested that a nuclear winter could result from the soot and debris injected into the atmosphere, leading to global cooling, crop failures, and famine extending to countries not involved in the conflict. These consequences were studied, documented, and incorporated into planning assumptions. The plans were not abandoned because of them. The logic was that if deterrence failed, the execution of the plan was necessary regardless of outcome. The goal was not survival. It was ensuring that the enemy could not survive either. Radiation experiments were conducted on vulnerable populations during the Cold War, under the justification of understanding the effects of nuclear exposure. Prisoners were subjected to testicular irradiation to study radiation's impact on fertility. Patients in hospitals were injected with plutonium without their knowledge to track how the body metabolized radioactive materials. Children with developmental disabilities were fed radioactive oatmeal in studies funded by the Atomic Energy Commission and Quaker Oats to understand nutrient absorption. Pregnant women were given radioactive iron to study fetal development. The subjects were often poor, institutionalized, or otherwise lacking in agency. Consent was not obtained, or it was obtained under misleading pretenses. The research provided data that informed safety standards, weapons design, and medical treatment for radiation exposure. The ethical violations were not accidental. They were enabled by a classification system that concealed the studies and a legal framework that granted researchers immunity under national security provisions. When some of these programs were revealed in the 1990s, official apologies were issued. Compensation was provided in select cases. The data obtained from the experiments remained in use. The Cold War ended not with a treaty or an armistice, but with the internal collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The dissolution was economic, political, and administrative. The systems built to sustain the conflict, the weapons, the doctrines, the surveillance apparatuses, the classification regimes, did not dissolve with it. Nuclear arsenals were reduced but not eliminated. Early warning systems remained active. Submarine patrols continued. The infrastructure of espionage was repurposed. The assumption that catastrophic conflict was possible and that preparation for it required secrecy and automation persisted in institutional form. The Cold War ended because one side could no longer sustain the competition. The logic that had driven the competition did not end. It was inherited by the states and systems that remained.